If you read 2 Kings 22, it says that during the time of King Josiah, the high priest discovered the scroll of the Torah hidden away in the temple after it had been lost for some time. Josiah immediately began enacting reforms to fit with the teachings of Moses by celebrating the biblical feasts, removing idol worship, and enforcing its rules. But many scholars are convinced this was all a fraud. It wasn't discovered at this time. Under Josiah, priests and scribes wrote portions of the law code of the book of Deuteronomy as part of their Yahwistic reforms and only attributed them to Moses. This is when the Lord was exclusively worshipped as the only God of Israel, and he was elevated to be seen as more than a lowly tribal deity. The scribes of Josiah created the laws of Deuteronomy and projected them onto a mythical past that they invented. But there are problems with seeing Deuteronomy as a product of Josiah's reforms. In fact, some of the very passages that have been used to argue this actually display characteristics that better fit with Israel's pre-monarchic times. Deuteronomy appears to be an ancient text that was only rediscovered under Josiah, not created. Most critical scholars believe the first version of Deuteronomy was created around the time of Josiah. It was later updated and redacted and then combined with other sources to form the Pentateuch. Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman say, "There is little doubt that an original version of Deuteronomy is the book of law mentioned in 2 Kings, rather than being an old book that was suddenly discovered. It seems safe to conclude that it was written in the 7th century BCE, just before or during Josiah's reign." James Gordon McConville and J.G. Miller say, "In the most critical interpretation, Deuteronomy remains firmly wedded to the 7th century and even to Josiah. Attempts to trace the growth from pre-Deuteronomic material through the Deuteronomic stage to Deuteronomistic redaction almost invariably move along a trajectory from Josiah, or somewhat before him, to the exile." One of the passages that has been used to support the lateness of Deuteronomy is the section of chapter 17 that speaks of kings ruling over Israel. When Moses supposedly gave this speech, there was no king of Israel, so there would have been no reason to issue rules for a reigning king. It is argued this section makes more sense if it was written after kings were ruling over Israel. But Karsten Vang evaluated this section and found it doesn't match the time periods when Israel had kings. In fact, he says, it appears to stem from a period where Israel has not yet any direct experience with monarchy as governmental system, but would be tempted to adopt the value system of ancient Near Eastern kingship together with the very notion of royal government. The passage states, "When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, 'I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me,' you may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, 'You shall never return that way again.' And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes, and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or to the left, that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel." Joshua Berman notes these verses are without parallel in the ancient Near East. No other legal treatise attempted to curb the wealth and power of a king like this, or attempted to prevent him from being elevated in status. But critical scholars have argued this passage is late and refers to the tendency for the later kingdom of Judah to rely on foreign military powers to send armies and horses to come to their aid, instead of relying on the Lord. The prohibition against many wives reflected the Israelites' king's tendency to marry foreign women as a way to strengthen alliances with other nations. Solomon was condemned for this very issue. So it has been argued this section was written after Israel had already established monarchies. But Nili Wazana notes that the idea of many horses, many wives, and excessive wealth were simply well-known characteristics of great kings. In other words, anyone aware of the wealth of a typical ancient Near Eastern king or an Egyptian king would think of these aspects to describe their wealth. From this, we should also note that Israel, in its pre-monarchic time, was very familiar with the fact that other nations were ruled by kings, and that the Israelites may desire a similar structure. It is human nature to desire a strong protector to rule and handle foreign affairs, which is why most human civilizations have tended to move into the direction of centralized leadership in exchange for protection and order. Given this tendency, it makes sense for pre-monarchic Israel to offer prohibitions and rules in case such a tendency would arise later in Israel. Additionally, Karsten Vang notes nothing in Deuteronomy suggests the horses in view are war horses. Given the prohibition is paired with women, silver, and gold, it most likely is a prohibition against the king acquiring many horses as a sign of wealth, and not related to requesting armies and war horses from other nations. The phrase caused the people to return to Egypt is also peculiar. It doesn't appear anywhere outside of Deuteronomy, and there is no evidence it was a concern of the later kingdom of Judah that people would return to Egypt. Judah did make alliances with Egypt, but that is different than what is being described in Deuteronomy 17. There is no known historical situation in the Egyptian-Judean relationship from the 8th to the 6th century where the phrase would make sense. On the other hand, the use of shuv haifil, with as direct object, matches Deuteronomy's strong Exodus orientation very well. In the rhetoric of Deuteronomy, Israel has left Egypt only a generation ago. The prohibitions can be understood as a warning that a future king might endanger the freedom of the people who were just liberated from slavery, and it fits with the overall perspective of Deuteronomy, which focuses on the recently liberated Hebrews from oppression. Next, the warning against the king having too many wives or women would also be a reasonable expectation of an ancient Near Eastern king. Jeffrey Tigay suggests Deuteronomy 17:17 may refer to large harems that were common among kings in the ancient world. It does not appear to directly refer to the danger of taking foreign wives to strengthen political alliances, but merely taking too many wives or concubines. Vang also notes something interesting about this verse. In the monarchic period of Israel, when a daughter would be brought into the king's family through the marriage of one of his sons, the family's social status would be raised considerably, and a class of noblemen resulted from this. But Deuteronomy has no knowledge of court officials or noblemen, meaning its stipulations assume a classless society. In fact, the prohibitions on a future king in Deuteronomy reflect its vision for an egalitarian Israelite society, where no Israelite is ever harshly oppressed again. In fact, verse 20 says that the king may not be lifted up above his brothers. This idea was not in view during Israel's monarchic periods, and would not have helped Josiah's goals or the hierarchy that was already established. In fact, kingship is not seen as a necessary Israelite institution, but as contingent, something no king would want to suggest to his subjects. Bernard Levinson says, in Deuteronomy's presentation, the king is reduced to a mere titular figurehead of the state, more restricted than potent, more otiose than exercising real military, judicial, executive, and cultic function. Joshua Berman says, from a literary standpoint, much of Deuteronomy is structured as a series of addresses to Israel as a collective you. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. You shall feast in the temple before the Lord your God, happy in all the undertakings in which the Lord your God has blessed you. There is a fundamentally egalitarian streak at play here. With the exception of priests and Levites, no group is granted preferred status. A king can only come about if the people decide they want one. Moreover, he is still supposed to see himself as an equal to his fellow Israelites. The king is commanded to copy and read from the Torah. Berman notes this command appears to place the king on the same level of every citizen. He is not someone who gives the laws, as it was for the surrounding kingdoms, but someone who receives law from God, just as all Israelites had. Unlike in Mesopotamia, where the king was responsible for the law, in Israel, the entire community is the recipient of the law, and its upkeep is a responsibility shared by every member of society. When read together with these laws, it leads to a single conclusion: the king's responsibilities are essentially those required of every other Israelite citizen. Such an egalitarian outlook was revolutionary in its thinking, but it would also not support the supremacy of the later Israelite monarchs, who decreed and enforced laws. As Levinson said, "How is it that Deuteronomy, which scholarly consensus views as having been promulgated by King Josiah, could nonetheless be so usurping of royal power in its law of the king?" Additionally, Gary Knoppers notes there is an important difference between the prohibitions of Deuteronomy 17 and the description of Solomon taking many wives in 1 Kings 11. It probably doesn't serve as any background for what we read in Deuteronomy. The author of 1 Kings describes Solomon's immense wealth and wisdom as gifts from God. Solomon's vast amount of horses are depicted in a neutral manner. In fact, the author suggests Israel was able to experience the Deuteronomic promise of rest in the land during the first part of Solomon's reign. The author does scold Solomon for taking foreign wives, but he did not use any of the phrases from Deuteronomy 17. This is peculiar, because the Book of Kings often quotes from Deuteronomy and makes comparisons to the ideal state found in it. In fact, the author doesn't seem to condemn Solomon for taking many wives, but for taking foreign wives, which caused foreign gods to be imported into Israel. Although it is true that Solomon is clearly violating the stipulation of Deuteronomy 17:17, this is not the issue of 1 Kings 11. So it doesn't appear that Solomon's actions inspired the laws of Deuteronomy. Next, the phrase "you may not put a foreigner over you, who is not your brother," would have no precedent in Israel's monarchic periods. There was never a time when monarchic Israelites were tempted by this, and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah always had native kings. Some have argued this refers to Assyrian hegemony imposed on Judah, but that was forced upon the Israelites, not something they were tempted to elect for themselves. Verse 15 does not refer to an external threat of a foreign power imposing itself upon Israel, but Israel being tempted to appoint a foreign king. The verse presupposes Israel would have full authority to decide if they wanted a king. The only time these aspects would be relevant was in the pre-monarchic times, as Vang says. Verse 15 gives best meaning in a pre-monarchic setting, when Israel was tempted to adopt the idea of royal power structure from outside, but had no ruling families yet, or chieftain role, who might qualify for royal power. Adding to this, Joshua Berman notes Deuteronomy advocates for an egalitarian society, where no tribe, class, or person has absolute authority. Instead, there was a revolutionary idea of separation of powers, divided between different groups. Bernard Levinson notes in the ancient Near East, and after the rise of the Davidic monarchy in Israel, the king was central for administering justice and giving laws. But in Deuteronomy, we see that priests and Levites are called to serve as members of a tribunal council, and to serve in the centralization and purification of the cultic worship. A king is not called at all to serve in this endeavor, unlike what we see elsewhere. Levinson says, the authors of Deuteronomy pointedly rejected the Israelite and Near Eastern convention that makes the king central to the administration of justice. However, another position was reserved for a judge, who was in office for select days to hear cases. The tribunal was not composed merely of priests, but a judge who served for a time, thus allowing a separation of powers. Also, we see no indication a king is needed to appoint judges and magistrates. Rather, the language is, "You shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment." The power comes from the people themselves. Berman says, Deuteronomy does not say anything about which representative bodies should make this decision, how many judges are to be appointed, or the hierarchy of the different levels of the judiciary. No doubt such apparatuses existed, but had Deuteronomy enshrined them in law, those bodies would have become the focus, In omitting the mechanisms, Deuteronomy retains its focus upon the citizenry as a whole, even as representatives affect the appointment of judges. The ultimate authority and responsibility rest upon the people. God also lists another office, which is that of the prophet. Individuals God will appoint to speak on his behalf, and could be seen as a check on the priests and judges. Additionally, we see references to a group called the Elders of Israel, which began under Moses and were called to deal with various issues as well. Instead of reading about a centralized power, like in Israel's monarchic time, Deuteronomy calls for a separation of powers. Nothing here would serve the needs of a centralized government in Jerusalem. Central to many Republican schemes, including that of Deuteronomy, is the notion of a mixed government and a degree of separation of powers. The idea that the effective division of power was predicated upon its distribution among pre-existing societal seats of power, such as nobles and commoners, was one that would hold sway throughout most of the history of Republican thought, from classical theorists through early modern thinkers as well. All this suggests that Deuteronomy fits with Israel's pre-monarchic time, and more so than the period after the rise of the Davidic monarchy. The later books of Samuel and Kings assume the need of the Davidic monarchy as a central power in leading Israel. But this feature is not present in Deuteronomy. As Bernard Levinson says, the legal corpus of Deuteronomy conceptualizes the king in a way that rejects all prevailing models of monarchic power within both ancient Israel and the broader New East. Deuteronomy submits a utopian manifesto for a constitutional monarchy that sharply delimits the power of the king. Sandra Richter also argues the core of Deuteronomy, referred to as Deuteronomian, assumes an economy of a populace living in small villages, and not one that reflects Israel's later periods. It knows nothing of public works, international trade, luxury items, or imports. Its main focus is on how a network of small villages is supposed to function. It also lacks evidence of state coinage. Taxation is described in a simple barter-based way over goods and services. The economy assumed in Deuteronomy is one in which the mechanisms for exchange were poorly developed, being primarily reciprocal and in kind, first general capacity for money, payment for dowry, blood money, or fines. It is very unlikely a later author writing during or after the monarchic period would describe the economy this way, nor would it be helpful to create a document for Israel that was completely unlike their current economy. This suggests Deuteronomy better fits with Israel's pre-monarchic times, when the economy was much simpler. Even Ua Pakala said, Deuteronomian does not imply any state infrastructure or organization. The monarch, the state, its structure, Judah, Jerusalem, and the temple are completely missing in the document. It seems that the book of Deuteronomy is less likely to fit with the time of Josiah, or any period after the rise of the Davidic monarchy. It contains traditions that fit with Israel's early history. So it is far more likely Deuteronomy was merely discovered during the time of Josiah, not created. Bernard Levinson compares Deuteronomy with the books of the Deuteronomistic history, like that of Judges to 2 Kings. In these books, we see a theological outlook that centers around the monarchy, which is absent in Deuteronomy. If Deuteronomy was written late, we should find the same theology, not an earlier and less developed form of it. In fact, in another video, we've already given several other reasons the Pentateuch is an early document, not something that was written and compiled late. The research of this video was supposed to be included with that one, but the video was already too long, so we had to save this data for a second video. There we demonstrated that other books of the Hebrew Bible presupposed the Pentateuch's existence. It is less surprising if a version existed before the Samaritan Jewish split. It lacks Zion theology, which would not have happened if it was written during or after the time of David. It lacks any reference to the temple in Jerusalem being the cultic site. And it most aligns with the time when northern leadership was the norm, and even accepted by the Judahites. It aligns with the style of Hittite treaties from the Late Bronze Age. It frequently uses a loan adaptation borrowed from an ancient Akkadian idiom that was rare in later texts. It fits with the time when the cultic site was on Mount Ebal. The biblical feast of Leviticus fit with an early culture. The Egyptian loanwords in it align with an early period. as do the names, customs, and practices. And there was a lot of unity in the Pentateuch, which suggests there was an original corpus that was minimally updated over time to deal with cultural shifts and evolving languages. And now, we can add that Deuteronomy knows nothing of Israel's later monarchic structure. It assumes a separation of powers that best fits with this early period, and the economic outlook also fits with Israel's early period. Instead of the passage that speaks of a king better fitting with the monarchic time, it actually better fits with the pre-monarchic period. All the evidence from multiple areas continues to suggest Deuteronomy, and the Pentateuch as a whole, best fits with the pre-monarchic time of Israel. And there is nothing implausible in suggesting that a figure named Moses is behind the beginning of this work. You made it to the end of this video, which means this message matters to you. If you want to see more content like this reaching people for Christ, you can help make it happen. Your support makes these videos possible. Click the link below and donate today. And if you want to go even deeper, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and a place to connect with others passionate about this mission.